hit the record button. I'm Maria Sharova. I am the Science Program Specialist at the Ecological Society of America, and today we're joined by lead authors from Cornell University. But before I introduce them and get started, I wanted to go over a couple of quick notes about logistics. For sound, you should be able to hear us through your computer or over the phone if you've dialed in. If you're on the phone, please remember to mute your line. And if you're having any technical trouble with the webinar, please send me an email at Maria, my first name, at esa.org. You can also send questions about the logistics or any technical issues you're having through the Q&A box in the webinar room or through the chat. We plan to have about 15 minutes after the presentation for Q&A, and please feel free to submit your questions during the webinar as well. You can put your questions into the Q&A box or in the chat. You can type them in whenever they come up, and at the end of the presentation, I will read them out loud for presenters to respond. While we hope to get to all of your questions, we may not be able to do so, and if we're unable to address your question, we encourage you to take advantage of the resources provided. Finally, we will be recording this webinar, and we will be sharing it with registrants as well as on the ESA website and through other social media outlets and listservs. After the webinar is over, you will be prompted to take a short survey, about 5 questions. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. Your feedback will help us make webinars like this one all the better. So the webinar today is based on ESA's most recent issue of the publication Issues in Ecology. Issues in Ecology summarizes the current status of scientific knowledge on environmental issues for a broad audience. These reports are proposed and authored by a panel of scientific experts. The issue we're discussing today is issue number 22, titled Innovative Finance for Conservation, Roles for Ecologists and Practitioners. And this issue offers guidelines for developing standardized, ethical, and effective conservation finance projects. Public and philanthropic sources currently supply most of the funds for protecting and conserving species and ecosystems. However, the private sector is now driving demand for market-based mechanisms that support conservation projects with positive environmental and social and financial returns. This report examines the legal, social, and ethical issues associated with innovative finance conservation and offers resources, guidelines, and priority actions that individuals and organizations will need to adopt in order to increase private capital commitments to conservation. Today, we are joined by authors Amanda Rodewald, who is the Senior Director for Avian Population Studies at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We're also joined by co-author John Tobin de la Puente, who is the founding co-director for the Initiative on Responsible Finance at the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. During the Q&A, we'll also be joined by co-authors Peter Arcese and Janice Serra. So with that, I will turn it over to Amanda and John to discuss their report and to go into more detail about innovative finance models for conservation.
Well, thank you, Maria, and thanks to everyone for making the time to join us today. We really appreciate it, and we're excited to share a bit more about our report. So, And so I guess to start off with, I think that a good context for the development of the conservation finance field is sort of captured on this slide, right? We've been seeing a pretty steady stream of reports and headlines that have been sounding the alarm for massive declines in biodiversity. And although these are worrisome just in and of themselves, these headlines, they're also especially sobering because these declines are happening at a time when the conservation community has been really active, right? We've been out there doing research, innovating and implementing practices and plans that are intended to stem these very declines, and yet they're continuing, right? So what this tells us is that business as usual just isn't going to be effective at conserving biodiversity, and we need to do more, and we need to do it better. But one of the challenges that we keep coming up against is insufficient funding. And so it's that insufficiency that really was one of the major reasons that people started exploring how we might be able to use private investments as a way to further advance global conservation efforts. And so I want to ask my colleague, John Tobin, to share a little bit with us now about that context. So John is one of the world leaders in conservation finance and was actually a co-founder of the Global Coalition for the Private Investment in Conservation. He recently co-authored a report that estimated the biodiversity funding gap that we're facing right now as a planet. And so I've asked him to just speak to that a bit right now. John?
Well, thank you, Amanda. And I hope you have that graph in front of you, the bar chart. I should mention, and Amanda already alluded to this, that perhaps the fundamental question that we face when we consider the long-term sustainable management of biodiversity is, how are we going to pay for it? And this graph, which came out of a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, the Paulson Institute, and a team here at Cornell, and it is within a publication that came out in September. We show that the amount of capital that is being spent on biodiversity conservation is actually relatively limited. No surprise there. It's the bar on the left of your graph. But then we took that one step further and asked ourselves, okay, if we want to conserve biodiversity and manage it sustainably for the long term, how much should we be spending? And as you can imagine, the estimate is subject to a number of assumptions, but we are reasonably comfortable with the numbers that we came up with on the bar on the right-hand side of this graph. The middle bar, the biodiversity financing gap, is simply the delta between what we're spending and what we should be spending now or in 2030 in order to achieve the overall objective of conserving biodiversity. The gap is massive, and it will require that we multiply by 6 or 8 the amount of capital that is going into conservation today. But what are the chances that governmental and philanthropic capital, which are today the main sources of capital that finance conservation activity around the world, will be able, in the short to medium term, fill that delta, that difference between actual spend and what we should spend? And we could not help but conclude that the likelihood was minimal. So then, where else to turn for capital? How else do we fill that biodiversity financing gap? And the only other source of capital of any real magnitude that we could think of, and we arrived at this conclusion somewhat reluctantly, was the private sector. But what would that look like? Well, the private sector could support conservation in a number of different ways. And Amanda, if you can switch to the next slide. Philanthropy, that's no mystery. Philanthropy has been supporting conservation activities for years, but the reality is dollars are limited, and it is nowhere even close to being able to scale up to a level that it will put a massive dent into the biodiversity financing gap. We have, in the last few years, been hearing more and more about impact investing, intentional investing, often at returns that, economic returns that are less than market, but where the investors are happy to return those lower than market returns in exchange for environmental and social returns. A very positive development. How scalable it is, that is the question. So where else? Mainstream investing. But wait, mainstream investing, mainstream capital has up until now been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So what do? We believe that there are a series of underappreciated investment structures that allow for the entry of capital into conservation from mainstream sources that could have really very significant positive impacts on conservation. There are three that are mentioned on this slide: green bonds, environmental impact bonds, and insurance for coastal resilience. And there are many others. But let me leave that there for now. We will return to these examples later in the presentation. And yeah, Amanda, please.
Great, thank you very much, John. So today we're really excited to provide a pretty high-level overview of this special issue in conservation finance. But I want to just first make you aware that this issue is actually the product of an international roundtable that we organized in 2018 at the University of British Columbia. So John and I, together with our two colleagues, Janice Sarah and Peter Arcese, both of whom are faculty at UBC, and as Maria mentioned, you'll be meeting during our panel discussion, we're co-organizers of that with us. And so we assembled a group of about 16 experts from various backgrounds, whether it's social science, environmental science, from the finance fields, legal backgrounds. And we came together to identify some of the key challenges that the field of conservation finance is facing and how we might strengthen the field and sort of move forward in order to really advance global conservation. So what I just want to acknowledge then that the individuals that you see here on this slide, we're actually drawing from, our collective discussions and ideas and suggestions for this issue and for this webinar. So I want to express my gratitude to every one of those individuals. I also want to recognize the groups that funded the roundtable and a conference that we also gave as part of that, and the special issue. So thanks to those organizations as well. So as you might imagine, when you bring together a group of people, you get a lot of really good ideas, right? And suggestions for how you can move forward. And we were able to distill these down to 5 priority needs that are related to these different elements that we'll be discussing today. So we have suggestions about how projects can be better designed, for metrics and monitoring, how one can make sure the proper social safeguards are constructed and included in projects, how we can use investment blueprints and also financial vehicles to better support these efforts. And so we'll be going through these in this order. So we'll start with one of the most obvious ones, right? And it seems self-evident, right? I mean, in conservation finance, we want to design projects that are investable, yeah, and that have meaningful conservation impacts. And although this sounds really obvious and that we wouldn't need to touch on it, it's important because we need to recognize that this is a new field for many people who are now engaging in this space. And so it's not always clear how to do that. So for the first step here, our suggestion is to really select evidence-based interventions that match goals. Now, I've underlined the word goals just to draw attention to, again, this obvious point that it's really important at the start to clearly articulate goals. Again, this sounds self-evident, but it's not always the case, right? And without clear goals, we can't really identify which interventions we need, right? So there are lots of roads out there, but we need to know where we're going to choose the right one. And there are many different resources that one can use to identify, the proper activities to support the conservation targets. So for many who are probably participating in this webinar, I mean, you would already do this, right? You're designing studies, you know how to really structure different conservation projects to reach the intended goals, but that's not always the case for everyone who might be coming from different fields. So resources like the example I show here, this is a group, they have a journal and a website called Conservation Evidence, where individuals are reviewing the literature and then really trying to establish the weight of evidence for different activities related to the outcomes people are seeking. So in the example you see on this slide for reducing fisheries bycatch, Well, there are some courses of action, like using streamer lines, that are known, they're well established to actually reduce bycatch. There are other ones that could actually be harmful, right? So these sorts of resources can be very useful for project developers. Of course, there are other approaches people can use, whether it's expert elicitation, doing your own literature reviews, that can also support this recommendation. In some cases, it's possible we're really moving into uncharted territories. And in those situations, we suggest that an adaptive management framework be used, where management activities, or actions are actually implemented as part of a study design where they can be evaluated and then adjusted as one moves forward. But irrespective of which approach is used, the important part is that to make sure that they're backed by evidence and that they also really align with the project goals. Another important part of project design, and one that's easy to overlook, is assessing and managing risks associated with the investments. Now, risks can span a number of different sort of dimensions. Like there are reputational risks, market-based risks, regulatory and legal risks, social risks, and environmental ones. So we can imagine, right, if there was a project that was designed to plant or restore a forest, well, that forest may be vulnerable to wildfire, to insect outbreaks, maybe to illegal harvest. And perhaps the project is located in an area where political unrest or conflict makes it difficult to enforce, or make sure that project area is protected. In some areas like sustainable agriculture or fisheries, for example, the crops or the stocks might actually be vulnerable to climate change, even if the project interventions were perfectly, implemented. So estimating risks is a really fundamental part of creating investment projects so that investment assets can be protected, and also so we can construct the risk return profiles that investors really need to evaluate their choices. The final project design element that I want to touch on in this section is the need to identify and incorporate co-benefits. Right, there are just too many challenges and competing needs out there right now for us to have the luxury to do one thing at a time. Right? We need to do more with less. And one way to do that is to actually, think about and bake in some co-benefits right from the start with an investment project. So an example might be if forests are if we're trying to restore or plant forests to ameliorate climate change risks or deal with that, well, we can do that in a way that also improves food and water security for local communities, can support rural livelihoods, can protect threatened or endangered species. Those are the co-benefits. So it's a really effective way that we can try to, essentially get more bang for our buck, and one that we strongly encourage. So the next set of recommendations is related to metrics and monitoring. And so, probably like many of you, it sure seems like we're hearing all of the time how we need to do more monitoring and evaluation with just about everything. And there's really good reason for that. And that's the case here with investment projects as well. Right? We need to develop frameworks that are both rigorous but also flexible so that we can create a suite of metrics and monitoring protocols that are scalable, so from small to large projects, that are cost effective, and also standardized at least to a degree that we all are using a common language and we understand, sort of a consistent meaning of certain metrics across projects and contexts. And we need these sorts of metrics in order to compare projects and investments sort of across that space, in order to also track and monitor the outcomes of individual projects so that they can be improved over time. Monitoring provides a learning opportunity that we're going to miss in its absence. Now, you might think that, okay, well, monitoring metrics, it's probably the conservation community that's really pushing the hardest for these, but that isn't the case, in fact. Investors also really care about metrics. A survey that was done several years ago actually found that 70% of impact investors think metrics, standardized metrics of some sort, are important or very important. And it makes sense if we think back to what John mentioned, right? Some of these investors are investing patient capital, so they're delaying getting a return, or they're willing to take maybe initially a reduced return because they really care about specific conservation or social outcomes, right? And so they want to be sure that those projects are actually bringing those sort of goals to fruition. And metrics can help to build confidence in the investment community as well as in the conservation community. Now, currently, the challenge is that a lot of the metrics that are being used, are just, they have a lot of shortcomings, right? Sometimes the metrics are just poor indicators of what they're trying to actually measure. They sometimes can have limited scope or relevance to the project goals, or those specific targets. They can be collected with inconsistent methodology and sometimes plagued with issues because there are many confounding variables that haven't sufficiently been addressed, or perhaps there haven't been the proper counterfactuals or references haven't been identified. We also, are aware that there are sometimes mismatches in the scale of measurement of a metric and the way a target is articulated. Right? So all of these things really still require work. And this actually is an area where ecologists and the conservation community, so many of you are probably tuning in today, where we have a real role to play. We can really help this area of conservation finance become stronger and really help support the whole field moving forward. So there are a lot of groups that are now popping up trying to develop metrics. Some of these are for-profit, other ones are partnerships, and some are non-for-profit. On this slide, you'll see the Global Impact Investing Network. This is a really large group. It's one of the more established organizations that are developing metrics, although most of them at this point have been used in the social impact investing space. And so they're trying to really, ramp up a lot of the metrics on the environmental side, but again, we're not quite there yet. So again, for the ecologists and conservation folks, this is a place where we can help contribute. And I want to, just before sort of moving on from the metric portion, just highlight this one area that's really promising, right? So we know how expensive it can be to actually, develop and conduct monitoring programs. But we're fortunate to now be in a world where it seems like every week there's another, big data resource available, whether it's generated through crowdsourced mechanisms or through, remotely sensed data platforms. And we have the ability to leverage these, sometimes to actually help with tracking progress over time, but at the very least to help us establish the baselines to which we're comparing the progress any investment project is making. So this third area that I want to touch on is about safeguards and social safeguards and protocols that we need to use. So it's probably doesn't take you long to imagine, if you were to sit there, about the ways that conservation finance projects could inadvertently negatively impact local communities. Right? And this is especially the case if we remember that currently about half of the world's population depends upon natural resource sectors, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, wildlife, those sectors for their livelihoods. And those are the very sectors that conservation projects are actually interfacing with. We've seen how sometimes very well-intended programs can have unexpected negative social outcomes, like as in with some payment for ecosystem services schemes. So in order to, I guess, avoid or minimize, the potential for negative social outcomes, we really recommend that there be best practices that are established. I mean, it would be great, for the field as a whole, but also for individual projects, right? And these practices generally are related to the different areas that you see on your screen here. Right? They're related to how one engages community members, and it also engages them in a way that they're not only just present, but they're actually empowered and their voices are heard. We need to find better ways to ensure that there's transparency, right? In the way projects are structured, where the money flows, who's online, who's on the line for kind of collateral and is ultimately responsible for that project. That transparency is really essential. We need to build in mechanisms that protect land tenure and indigenous rights. There is a risk that some of these projects could actually facilitate land grabs. So that needs to be avoided. And again, these are things that they're not insurmountable. They just require that we be aware and we be attentive to the fact that there is some level of risk out there and take steps to prevent that. A lot of the really effective projects that are out there now, and also this includes even, ones coming out of sort of community-based conservation spaces, have developed a shared governance system where they're really being run by a combination of local experts and stakeholders, as well as ones that might be associated with other professional communities. And then finally, we need to be sure that safeguards are established that are sort of customized for particular projects and are that align well with the specific contexts and the cultures of those local communities. So, I mean, this can sound really daunting, I think, in a lot of respects, but there are some really excellent models out there that we can follow. One of the members of our international roundtable, Brody Guy, is the director of the Coast Funds. This is an extremely successful First Nations-led conservation trust fund in British Columbia, Canada. And it focuses on, having a sustainable economic development and conservation happening in the Great Bear Rainforest and the Haida Gwaii. And so one of the things that this Coast Funds does that's been so successful is that it's based entirely upon an Indigenous directed governance system that includes self-determination of where they want to go with that project. And they've developed a series of different metrics where they're really tracking to be sure that the community is benefiting from this. So they're not just implementing these in a way and assuming that the outcomes are good because that's the intention. They're tracking them to be sure that it's delivering as they're hoping. And so you can see here, they're tracking the First Nations businesses, to the extent to which more are created or expanded based on the availability of funds. Permanent jobs in different sectors, attendance to higher education institutions by members of the community. So again, these are good examples that we can turn to for how to make sure that these conservation finance projects are not only delivering good outcomes for the planet, but also for people as well. So with that, right now, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn this over to John to take over the last few points that we have. So thank you very much. And John, I'll pass to you.
Thank you, Amanda. So let me share my own screen and hopefully you'll be able to see a slide that is priority need 4. Is that right? Do you see that?
Yep, it looks good. Oops, you want to make it larger there on your screen.
Yeah, just changing things across a little bit. And
there you go.
Perfect.
That's good.
Well, thank you. So to continue with the priorities for the field of conservation finance, we believe that it's crucial that we create, develop, and implement the kinds of financial tools and blueprints that will generate economic returns and that at the same time ensure conservation outcomes. Yes, very clear from what Amanda has said up until now, but what does that look like? Well, you can split it up in any number of ways, but what we think are the key points are, we need to articulate the investment case. Why would private return-seeking capital invest in conservation finance? Are the risk-adjusted returns ones that private investors will want to be part of? Also, how do we achieve scale? How do we replicate, aggregate, standardize these transaction ideas such that each time one such transaction is executed, it is not a pilot that will remain a pilot and will have been a useful, interesting experience that benefited a small number of lives or hectares of protected area, but don't really make a difference in the long term and at a scale that will make a difference. Next, we need to identify social and environmental metrics. Amanda has spoken about that, but it bears repeating because it is crucially important. And in the area of biodiversity, and this is often not appreciated by many who are looking at this field, that is very difficult because, well, in the area of pure returns-driven finance, it is quite clear what the metrics are. Risk-adjusted return on investment. And this is a simple number, a percentage of return based on the total investment size, and it's unambiguous, it's easy to calculate. Even the climate finance space has an environmental metric which is helpful to them. They work with return on investments, but when it comes to assessing the environmental impact, the environmental returns associated with a climate project, at least they're speaking in a common language. They have the shared metric of metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Unfortunately, in the area of biodiversity, there is no such shared metric. There is no common language. How do you compare the success of two different transactions that deliver the same risk-adjusted economic returns, but one of which was set up with the idea of, say, reducing deforestation, while the other was set up with the idea of saving a particular population of an endangered species. Those two non-financial metrics are not easily comparable. So how do we breach that gap and come up with a set of metrics that will cut across the entire environmental space, an area that will still require a lot of thought? And then finally, building capacity. Investment bankers and asset managers don't know a lot about conservation. A surprising number of them would like to contribute to conservation through their work. Much more, investors would like to contribute to biodiversity conservation through their investments, but they may not understand the ins and outs of what is happening on the ground. Conversely, conservationists, no surprise, don't necessarily understand a lot about the terms of finance and the thinking that goes behind or that goes into assessing a particular transaction. Next, I'd like to tell you a little bit about CPIC. And CPIC was set up with the idea of tackling some of the obstacles that I touched on in the prior slide. CPIC was launched at the World Conservation Congress of 2016, which, as many of you will know, is the every 4-yearly environmental gathering organized, hosted by the IUCN. And at the most recent World Conservation Congress, the IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, Credit Suisse, and a group at Cornell came together to launch this initiative, together with a series of partners, to try to tackle the barriers to the entry of private return-seeking capital into conservation. Membership has grown considerably since then, 100 or so organizations, including small environmental boutiques, large financial institutions, mainstream environmental organizations, a smattering of academic institutions and law firms. And one of the first areas to which CPIC turns its attention was to the development of investment blueprints. And these, as modeled by CPIC, have come to be known as CPIC blueprints. There's a definition on the upper right-hand side of this slide. A CPIC blueprint is a model financial transaction structure intended to help facilitate replicable investments in priority conservation projects. What exactly does that mean? Well, let me put it in very simple terms. Think of it as a cookbook or a recipe for a particular kind of transaction in a particular kind of setting, geographic or habitat type. And one in which a series of key components of that transaction have been identified, explained, and put to paper, and that information has become readily available or is made available to the community that is looking to generate revenue from their conservation project or their protected area. This sounds like it would be a no-brainer, but in the finance space, this is highly unusual. Financial institutions and investors tend to develop investment ideas and to keep them very close to their chest, because sharing them broadly would lead to their competitors being able to use that intellectual property. And so this goes against the grain of how finance works, but we have been successful in working with institutions that have approached the issue of CPIC and its objectives as a pre-competitive issue. Okay, so what do these CPIC blueprints include? They include an articulation and identification and articulation of who the key stakeholders are, a determination of what expected conservation outcomes may be, an estimation of what the anticipated cash flows will be, and an identification of the types of investors and of the types of capital that will be required in order to execute the deal. And the development of those freely available blueprints covers 5 main habitat types, which reflects the interest of CPIC members and the formation of certain working groups. And they are on the right-hand side of this slide: coastal resilience, green infrastructure, sustainable forests, sustainable agriculture, and sustainable coastal fisheries. And this I include here only as an example of a summary diagram of cash flows and stakeholders for one particular blueprint. But if you're interested in learning more about these models, and that's exactly what they are simply models, I'd encourage you to visit the cpicfinance.com website, where you will find a lot more information. Now, in terms of the other priority needs for the area, the fifth and last one that we looked at in this work was a reconsideration of existing financial vehicles and structures to improve their flexibility and make them more impactful for conservation. Let me just bring up the three examples that I touched on before at the very beginning of our presentation when I said, we'll come back to these. The first one was green bonds. As I believe I mentioned then, green bonds is a market that has grown hugely since it was kicked off in the year 2007. Nevertheless, despite the massive amounts of capital in the hundreds of billions of dollars yearly that are being raised now in the green bonds market, an overwhelming majority of the capital raised in these transactions is going towards energy efficiency projects, investments in alternative energy, etc., but only a tiny amount into conservation and biodiversity protection. That is changing and it's growing quickly. And the example of the 2017 Republic of France Green Bond is one, which up until then was the largest green bond issuance ever. Once at a value of 7 billion euros. And yes, some of this money went to more traditional green activities like green buildings and public transport, etc. But a considerable amount of capital has gone towards biodiversity related activities. And I should mention in passing that this issue of bonds has been followed on by subsequent issues, and the total amount outstanding right now under France's green bond program is in the order of 25 billion euros. Another example I wanted to touch on is that of the environmental impact bonds. EIBs, as they are known, are a really nifty idea. The first one was actually closed probably no more than 3, perhaps 4 years ago. So it's, relatively speaking, a brand new product. There have been maybe a half dozen transactions out there, all of them in the United States. And some of you may have heard of social impact bonds. They started in the area of prison recidivism and proved to be reasonably successful in some cases there, also in early education, and the basic model has been moved into the environmental space. What does an impact bond consist of? Well, the first thing I should mention is that an impact bond is not a bond at all. It's a contractual arrangement between various parties. But the reason environmental impact bonds hold so much promise is because they fill a niche that hasn't been filled before. There are many, many situations in which organizations, and particularly governmental entities, cannot address an issue that they know is going to result in very substantial expenditures later in the future, in the 5, 10, 15-year horizon, because they don't have the money now to make those investments. So why don't they have that money? Why don't central governments provide that financing? Well, in many cases, there is political opposition. In others, it happens that there are other restrictions to using, in many cases, novel solutions. And in the way payback for investor happens is based on a pay-for-performance mechanism. If the intervention was successful, investors get paid. If it was not successful, they do not. So these forest resilience bonds are one example, perhaps the best known example of environmental impact bonds now. You may have seen some coverage in the mainstream media, yes, even in the mainstream media, about the forest resilience bond of blue forest conservation. But the very simple idea that they had was wait a minute, in the forests of the Western United States, way too much money is being spent on controlling wildfires. Indeed, roughly 50% of the Forest Service's budget, up from 10 to 15, 30 years ago. And why are we having all of those wildfires? Because we are not clearing the understory of these forests from dead and decaying vegetation. And what the Forest Resilience Bond does is attract private capital to finance these interventions that the Forest Service cannot afford, clearing the forests for burning or burnable vegetation that it will then result in large wildfires at a fraction of the cost of what it would cost to fight those wildfires later. And in doing so has attracted quite a bit of attention, not just of the Forest Service, but for example, water utilities and other beneficiaries of the intervention. And it's important to mention that the ecological side effect of this intervention is to render the forests more similar to what they looked like in pre-industrial times than they do now. Finally, I'd like to mention the example of the Mesoamerican reef insurance as an illustration of nature insurance. Natural capital assets, just like ordinary assets, can be insured, allowing the owners or beneficiaries of the asset to receive payouts when a disaster strikes. In the case of this particular transaction, premiums are paid to a particular Mexican insurer, which is working within the sort of broader international reinsurance market. And when a particular storm hits at some measurable wind speeds, payouts are made to an organization, the Coastal Zone Management Trust, that then manages reef restoration and rehabilitation. So, in summary, I will mention that conserving biodiversity at global scales will require that we develop innovative ways to generate new funding streams. This is no surprise. This is almost a truism. However, where the twist comes is that we would argue, only limited potential in generating new funding streams from additional federal agencies or foundations that have not been tapped into yet. Private capital may remain, at this point, the greatest hope for generating capital and supporting conservation while generating returns for those private return seeking investors. So I will leave it there for now and pass it back to Amanda for any acknowledgements and questions.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks so much to all the groups, and the people who've contributed to this, the issue, to funding it, and also helping to produce this webinar. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda and John, for a wonderful report and the information that you've provided us today. So right now, I'll invite Peter and Janice to share their videos with us and join us for the Q&A. So I'll get started with the first question, which is, while many suggest that private financing of carbon storage and sequestration projects have the potential to finance the conservation and/or restoration of forest, savanna, and estuarine ecosystems, the citable examples seem scarce. Can you suggest why this remains the case?
I could take that question. I think that's something that comes up often, but at the same time, John and Amanda have both given examples of profit and not-for-profit entities which are already really active in this space. And I think if you do a bit of searching, you'll find brokerage houses from large to small, places like South Pole and others, and international companies like New Forest, Lime Timber, and others are actively developing and selling such projects. I think one of the reasons it's been harder for people to get traction on the actual costs of these things is because many of the deals are proprietary, and some of them then stay public, and there's a lot of room then for skepticism about how real they are, what the actual pricing might be, particularly when one has an example, for example, of a cash for logs versus the long-term possibility of cash for carbon if those logs were not harvested. In contrast, I do think that there are now becoming a few costed projects and a few publicly available prices through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and others, which are making this more evident. And as more precise examples become available, I'm confident personally that many people will see that there are good outcomes, especially for those people who are private landowners or potentially indigenous groups who have interests in addition to revenue generation, such as the restoration of culturally intact landscapes, or those which are more representative of the historical state of states, as John mentioned in his forestry example.
Awesome, thank you. And if anybody else has anything else to add, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I can move on to the next question. Okay, so another question is, how can conservation finance meet the legal constraints on investors' participation in scaled up conservation projects?
So I can take this question. I think the legal framework is actually really important, and it's currently in flux, which I think is very helpful for conservation finance. So directors and trustees of institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers, et cetera, have fiduciary duties that inform their investment decisions and their accountability to their own stakeholders. So the development of reliable, standardized monitoring frameworks, the ability for them to assess benefits across projects and year over year, is going to allow them to direct their investment portfolios to conservation projects while meeting their legal duties of what is called prudence and care. I'd also add that the legal framework for corporate governance is currently shifting from a short-term shareholder wealth maximization paradigm to one that now significantly values and accounts for environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG, in investment decision-making, including in sustainable investing and also protection of biodiversity. That's good news. It means institutional investors are now reporting co-benefits for people and planet in their investment decisions to their stakeholders. So from our perspective, conservation projects that are well-designed, investable, meet multiple ESG goals, and allow investors to track progress are going to be increasingly within the legal remit of global investors. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks, Janice.
If I may, Maria, I just want to say that the importance of that issue, of the sort of fiduciary duties question, the importance in terms of how crucial an obstacle it has been up until now to the growth of ESG investing cannot be overstated. And finding the right solution to the paradox, such that investors can invest in products that provide those co-benefits, the impact of that would be immeasurable. So thank you, Janice.
Excellent, yeah. Another question that we have is, with increasing intensity and frequency of natural disasters under a changing climate, how viable is nature insurance in the long run? Won't certain groups get priced out as premiums rise?
Does anyone else want to tackle that?
Go ahead, John, but I might add to what you say.
No, I actually didn't hear the full question about being outpriced. Could you repeat that?
Sure. I'd be
Maria?
happy to. The question is, with increasing intensity and frequency of natural disasters under a changing climate, how viable is nature insurance in the long run? Won't certain groups get priced out as premiums rise?
Well, if the groups we're referring to are sort of local groups who are looking, as in the case of the Mesoamerican reef insurance, to protect their assets, yes, they may no longer be able to afford their insurance as things get progressively worse. I don't think it represents a significant risk for insurance companies, for the very simple reason, and so many people have learned this the hard way, that a lot of insurance is repriced yearly. And this yearly repricing actually has led to insurance companies not becoming the natural allies of climate scientists and conservations that many people thought they would become, because many people thought, okay, well, if the climate is changing and resulting in more extreme weather events, that represents a loss for the insurance companies. Well, it would if they didn't reprice their insurance yearly. But as they do, and premiums will simply continue to increase as climate change continues to result in more extreme weather events, unfortunately, insurance will not be the natural ally that many thought.
So maybe if I can just add, from a legal framework, one of the things that we advise companies increasingly is that inaction on climate change and inaction to protect biodiversity is likely to make insurance unaffordable or even make them uninsurable. So in fact, it's a positive motivator for companies to actually shift their activities. And the reality is, as John says, is that insurance companies are out ahead on this in terms of their pricing models, et cetera. But you have a lot of reinsurers like Swiss Re who are saying, we'll partner with you. We'll partner with you to do the proactive work that actually protects biodiversity at the front end. And therefore, we will control insurance premiums and we'll do it collaboratively with co-benefits. So there's a lot of potential in that market, in my view. But the questioner has a valid point that inaction could create real problems.
I'll just add very quickly that a carbon project now being developed or discussed on Vancouver Island has taken that into account because, of course, carbon projects insure themselves against things like forest fire. In this case, where we have overstocked forests that are more likely to undergo catastrophic fire, there are some synergies in, say, reducing thinning to an old growth state, and it's simultaneously reducing the likelihood of fire. Insurance companies will, of course, as John mentioned, adjust their rates according to their perceived risk. And so there are many things projects can often do to facilitate the costing and reduce insurance costs. And that's quite standard in many carbon projects.
Excellent. And I do want to be sensitive to the time. I know it's 1:58, so I'll ask one more question and then we can wrap it up. So let's see. I work for a conservation organization. What is the easiest way for me to keep up to date with the latest science on private investment and conservation efforts?
Great, thanks. I think there are a few good resources. So one of them would be to become engaged with the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation, which John has mentioned. There are also other networks. There's the Conservation Finance Network that's run out of Yale University. And so they send out regular updates and newsletters that provide really useful overviews, of some of the work in this field. Janice, I know you're involved with some groups too on the climate finance side. I don't know if you have some recommendations there, and yeah, John, if others.
Well, I would add, it's broader than just conservation, but the Canada Climate Law Initiative sends out regular updates, including on conservation finance, to try and keep its network up to date on the most recent developments in Canada and internationally.
And many people who may not have heard the name yet, Ecosystem Marketplace is also somewhere which often keeps us up to date, and one could subscribe to that as a web feed.
A fabulous resource, yes.
Excellent. Yes, thank you for sharing those resources with us. With that, I would like to end the webinar. Attendees, as you're closing out, you'll be prompted to take a survey. If you could just take a couple of minutes to answer those 5 questions. It shouldn't take longer than a couple minutes, but it would be very helpful for us at ESA and the presenters here to let us know what you learned and what you liked or what you didn't like. So thank you again. And with that, I will end.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.